With me today from The Athletic, we have our Everton writer, Paddy Boyland, as well as Phill Hay and Matt Slater as well. Paddy, we have to go back to the game on Saturday, Everton versus Bournemouth. Everton, what, 2-0 up? And I'm watching that thinking, this looks very tasty.
Yeah.
87th minute, it all comes crumbling down. Bournemouth end up winning that match 3-2. Can you just explain from where you're sitting what happened in that match?
Oh, it's just a complete capitulation in the space of 9 minutes right at the end. And this is one of the things about football, I guess. You can be so good for 87 minutes as Everton were, and I think they were utterly dominant up to that point. But if you have 9 minutes as bad as those at the end, you
Mm.
deserve everything you get. One of the things that I picked up on in the post-match press conferences was Bournemouth manager Andoni Iraola talking about how he felt Everton were the better team, and he told Sean Dyche, the Everton manager, that Everton deserved to win. Um, I mean, he's obviously entitled to his opinion, but I disagreed with those comments because right at the end, when it all came to it, right at the end, Everton weren't up to the job, and there's just a load of stuff in there that I think will worry Everton fans, that this kind of recurrent fragility at the back, the ability to concede goals more or less out of nowhere, and experienced players making mistakes time and time again. So not a pretty picture at all. And just a shame because for 87 minutes, that was some of the best football I've seen under Sean Dyche since he arrived.
Yeah. Phil, Everton fans must feel it's like Groundhog Day a little bit. You look at those first three defeats in the Premier League and then a League Cup win against Doncaster. The weird thing is, this is exactly the same set of results as the beginning of last season as well. Three straight league defeats and then a League Cup win against Doncaster. You've covered clubs like Leeds. When these kind of results happen, each one must feel like a massive blow for that fan base.
It does as time goes on, and that's probably the point. This is like the intro, these results to the bigger story at Everton. They are a textbook example of a club who've been circling the drain and have been circling the drain for a while now, going back a couple of seasons. I covered Leeds when they were relegated in 2023. And they were one of a few clubs who were trying to get away with murder at the bottom of the table. Leeds were one, Leicester City were another, Everton were a third, and Everton did get away with it. But what that season reminded me of, and I have a feeling that Paddy will probably have felt this at Goodison on Saturday, is that when the rot starts to set in, there's almost no level of incompetence that a team can't stoop to. And what I mean by that is that even though what happened at Goodison at the weekend felt like it should have been impossible, shouldn't have happened, that it just should not have been the outcome. There's that little bit of your fibre that's saying to you, I kind of knew that was going to happen. That was always going to happen because we've reached that point where that is the way in which it's set in. I think Everton were probably at the top of the list of clubs who could not afford a poor start this season because the timeline behind them for the past couple of seasons meant that it wasn't going to take a huge amount for the infighting to start a game, which, from the outside looking in, it seems to have done already at this stage to a certain extent. The way it is now, over the past couple of seasons, there are points deductions, they've had near misses and they've run it very close, but they've never been cut adrift in the Premier League. And I'm not saying they're cut adrift now because they definitely aren't. It's too early for that. But I think if it happens, I'm not sure they'll find a way back. And I suspect that'll be part of the reason for the tension at Goodison, that it's already looking problematic. It's already looking worrying. And we're only just into September.
Yeah, I think Phil picks up on a really interesting point in that as soon as it went to 2-1, there was immediately an edginess in the stadium. And there's a sort of Everton that kind of feeling that comes in where you almost expect the worst case scenario. So as soon as it's 2-1, you're thinking this is going to either end up 2-2 or 3-2 Bournemouth. That edginess you can feel inside Goodison. You can see it permeates onto the pitch. Sean Dyche was frantically screaming at his players to get back in position. And it was almost like there was a collective amnesia in those final 9 minutes that they just weren't able to avoid or overcome. And that's not just the players, by the way. I think the manager, Sean Dyche, was culpable in some of the kind of clunky decision making throughout the game. Going on to that Everton, that point, and I think this is now a rot over an extended period of time. And I think the wider context here is that this transcends Sean Dyche and it transcends him by quite some time. I think fans are just pretty sick and tired of being the whipping boys, the fall guys at just about every juncture. And the result on Saturday kind of added into this sense that no matter what they do, no matter what the players do, and no matter what's going on behind the scenes, they seemingly can't escape this process of circling the drain, as Phill puts it. Whenever they look like they're just about to push out, they either fall back in themselves or they're dragged back in by factors seemingly out of their control. So I think this was quite a mental blow this early in the season. They were soundly beaten by Brighton. They were soundly beaten by Tottenham and could well be beaten by those teams in any season, given the resources they have now. But this was one at home against Bournemouth, who really weren't at the races for 87 minutes, that they should have won.
Okay, Matt, we've been here before with Everton. We've spoken about clubs in crisis. We've seen what's happening on the pitch. It's fair to say it's not just Sean Dyche's fault, as Paddy's just alluded to. I mean, there's more at play here, and we'll definitely go into this a bit more in depth later on.
Yeah, of course. Like, why do clubs do well? Why do clubs do badly? This is sort of my bread and butter, really. And what goes out on the pitch, the product on the pitch, so much work goes into that. There's the obvious stuff, in terms of recruitment and training and the strength of your academy. But these clubs are quite complicated organisations, and the chief exec, the ownership, everyone plays a role. And Everton have basically been below average, I'd say, almost in every regard, for quite some time. So it's I'm afraid what Everton fans are putting up with is a collective failing. And, we've done lots on that in the past. And I know we're going to talk about the takeover, and that brings you in to conversations around the finances, of course. This is a distressed asset. It's a forced sale. These are not good things for any organization, for any company. I don't normally talk about football. I'm minded to talk a little bit more about football, because I wasn't at the game. I watched on Match of the Day. I've read Paddy's pieces. I've read other people's pieces. And I'm a little bit intrigued by Dyche at the moment, because he had an absolute nightmare last year and he did well. He was the club's spokesman. And this keeps happening where ownership is just absent. There was situations that, the chief exec, there was lots going on behind the scenes. There was no communication from the club whatsoever. And week after week after week, Sean Dyche had to answer questions that were just ridiculous. That, for one man to answer, one person to answer, and he did a good job. And he actually, I think they managed to put together 2 or 3 just key spells of competence, and that was enough last season. Is it going to be enough this season? Well, I think Phil's already outlined that it might not, and I agree. But we shall see. But I just got the impression that there was respect. There was a sense that Dyche is doing a good job. I didn't detect love, and I'd love to hear Paddy on this. But there was definite respect. That's a tough job. That bloke's, but that bloke's doing it, and and he's, good. It seems to me that was very skin deep, very fragile, and maybe that's just the nature of the club at the moment. That just something bad can happen, and it's like, oh. But I thought, what I saw on Match of the Day and what I understood about the where that game went was poor. He managed that really poorly, and everyone keeps talking about how late the the first goal was, the first Bournemouth goal was. Everybody knows that Premier League games go now to about 95, 96 minutes. There was 10% left of that game. He'd made 2 subs. Well, he made 2 subs in total. Bournemouth made 5. They started to change it with half an hour to go. That first goal was a good goal, right? Can happen. But goals 2 and 3 were dreadful. That was just a team that was knackered against a team that was suddenly outrunning them to everywhere across the pitch. Now, you can talk about being frantic on the sidelines, and I don't know. I would have thought 90% of the crowd could see what was going on. Yeah, James Garner, yeah, Ashley Young, yeah, players on the bench.
Mm.
And what does that say? If like I'm not putting you in,
Is
I'd
is
rather
this
go
not
with the
though?
knackered guys out there.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
this not though a bit symptomatic of the process of the death spiral, if you want to call it that, on the way to relegation or implosion or anything else? One of the first things that happens, again, I saw this at Leeds, is that your manager gets isolated in the sense that the people above him disappear because they're difficult questions that they don't want to deal with and often can't answer. So they find themselves sitting in front of the media, often saying, I can't answer this either, but I'm going to do my best. I'm going to wade through it. And you do have periods where you get, that kind of that sort of spirit where people dig in and try to make it happen, but it's temporary because it takes a lot of stamina. Things don't get better, things don't improve, the squad doesn't improve, and it starts to catch up with you. And I think Matt's right. I think Dyche is going to come in for more and more criticism if this goes on for any length of time, and perhaps justifiably, because he still has to manage the team tactically as best he can. But this to go back to that thing about textbook example of a team circling the drain. It's also a textbook example of how a club functions and what it looks like when there is basically no senior management there or no proper guidance. And the consequence is always that your manager becomes isolated, he becomes exposed, and he usually ends up getting sacked as a club go down.
Yeah. I also want to caveat this and say, we're only 3 games into the season,
Yeah,
the Premier League season.
Yeah.
There's still a long way to go. But Paddy, not to back you into the corner, but there's some really strong opinions there, really. And I saw you nodding a few times on that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so Matt talks about the frustration inside Goodison. I suppose what was unfolding in front of those Everton fans in attendance. And it was quite clear that after about 65, 70 minutes, the team needed an injection of energy. It's quite clear that I think Bournemouth made their first 3 subs around 70, 75. They made another 2 before Dyche turned to his bench. His first sub was on 83. His second sub was on 88. And that's a recurrent theme for Dyche, really. He would always tell you in press conferences that his stats, which we've not seen, by the way, but his stats back up the theory that you don't change a team that is, in his view, functioning correctly, even if that means fatigue sets in at the end. But I did see a huge physical disparity between Bournemouth at the end and Everton, to the point where for one of the goals in my match piece on Saturday, I think it was the Lewis Cook second, you actually see him sprint past about 2 or 3 prone Everton players in midfield before getting the free header in the box. He's run 50, 60 yards, half the pitch, and nobody's gone with him because exhaustion is set in. So I think it was a surprise for Everton fans, in one sense, not to see James Garner come off the bench, not maybe to see another right back replace Seamus Coleman, who has only just come back from fitness and is now a veteran. And it is, I suppose, one of the growing criticisms of him as a manager. Now, he does have credit in the bank for last season. He definitely does. I think he did a brilliant job in very challenging circumstances. My theory is that there is always a shelf life to Sean Dyche, purely because, as Matt says, he's never anybody that you're going to love. You're not going to love the style of play. It's not progressive enough for fans to really cling on to. So what they end up with is a situation where they tolerate functional football, or what they perceive to be functional football, as long as it brings results. But as soon as it doesn't bring results, there's always a clamour for something different. Now, Dyche may well, and I think in reality, he probably will get over this hurdle with Everton, and Everton will improve. But there will come another point within the next 12 months, the next 24 months, where we will be having these same conversations again, because that's the nature of the beast with him as manager. It's just, it's one of those situations where the club is crying out for an injection of positivity from somewhere. And it's been stuck now in limbo, effectively. This is what we need to remember. The club has been stuck in a state of stasis now for the best part of 2 years, as they've undergone an ownership transition that still hasn't happened. Farhad Moshiri, the current owner, has wanted out for about 2 years. He's attempted to sell to multiple different people, and they've all collapsed. And in some cases, unsurprisingly, they've collapsed, given what Matt and others have reported. But what you've got at the top level of the club right now is a one-way owner, an interim board that has been there now much longer than it was anticipated to be. And very little beyond that before you get down to the football, senior football levels, director of football and everything else. They're just stuck in this limbo. They're stuck in this vacuum where they're waiting for something new. They're waiting a year for the new stadium, but they just have to find a way of getting through. And I think that becomes tougher and tougher every year because you have to make sacrifices every year with sales and everything else.
Yeah, super quickly, and we want to go into the failed bids for ownership of Everton in just a second, Paddy. But you've got a piece out on The Athletic right now talking about the transfer activity, and you're talking about a club that needs an injection of positivity. They've done quite well getting rid of Onana. I mean, 70 million in this transfer window of getting rid of players from Everton is pretty good money. And talk about balancing the books with PSR as well. Look like they're operating at a good level, but have the players that have come in, are they of the caliber that can offer that injection of positivity that you're talking about?
I mean, I think some of them definitely are. Iliman Ndiaye, who signed for around £15 million from Marseille, he made his first Premier League start for Everton on Saturday and was head and shoulders the best player on the pitch before he went off on 83 minutes. Now, I point out 83 minutes there because obviously we have a timestamp for what happens after that and everything else. And there's probably not a direct correlation between those two things, but Everton's best player went off the pitch. Everton's second best player, Dominic Calvert-Lewin, went off the pitch 5 minutes later. And very quickly, they stopped resembling a functioning football team. So Ndiaye, yes, Ndiaye is very exciting. Everton haven't had a player like him, an entertainer, somebody who gets bums off seats for quite some time. There are a few other signings that you look at and think if everything clicks and Dyche plays them enough and they get used to the speed of things quickly, they could be good signings. I think Jake O'Brien, for example, from Lyon, he's very highly rated as a young defender. He eventually could be the successor to Jared Branthwaite. But going back to Dyche and his caution and his pragmatism, he tends not to blood these players early. He tends to go where there's a 50-50 split decision with the tried and tested. So first game of the season, it wasn't Iliman Ndiaye behind the striker, as most Everton fans would have wanted. It was Abdoulaye Doucouré. Fans wanted to see Jesper Lindström, the loan signing from Napoli, wide. And it was the same two from last year, Dwight McNeil and Jack Harrison. All decent players and they're all right, all have made contributions to Everton. But what you've actually ended up with in the first part of the season, at least until Saturday's game, was the same misfiring group of attackers, forward players that struggled so much last season. I think only Sheffield United scored fewer goals than Everton last year. Everton were right at the bottom in terms of open play goals. So there was a lack of creativity in the squad. And they were also the biggest underperformers versus their XG. So what that told us from last season is that there's a whole load of data here to suggest that if you keep playing this attack, the results are unlikely to improve too much because they're not as good as their peers in the Premier League. That's been another source of frustration for fans. Now, I think there is a scenario where these players gradually work their way into the side, and Ndiaye started on Saturday, and things do improve. But there's been a real potent mix of that and an injury situation where they've been deprived of people like Jared Branthwaite, who was so good for them last season, a really key player. And the result of it all has been an Everton side that's looked bruised, undercooked, and to be honest, just not ready for the start of the Premier League season. And historically, you can go back even to last season and we'd have probably been saying the same thing. So to my point earlier, we probably lived the same season over and over again with Sean Dyche. I mean, I'm starting to think we do.
I think Brozier from Chelsea probably underlines more than anything the position Everton are in at the moment. I get that that Ipswich had a look, but Ipswich are not really a pressure point in the Premier League. It's a really stable environment there, and McKenna's had them in good shape for a long time, and they might go down, but I think they could suck that up. He's not going to be fit until the middle of October, so it's a big gamble from Everton's point of view on the basis that they can't use him for a while. And I do think that is, it's certainly my experience, the sort of transfer and the sort of option that you do start taking a risk on against your better judgment when you're in an awful lot of trouble. Everton need players who are really sort of like immediate impact, not somebody who won't have played until June and who is so lacking in fitness that, from what I've read, Everton aren't even paying any of his wage, his Chelsea wage at the moment. Just to go back to one thing Paddy said as well, about positivity and the need for it at Goodison Park. I actually WhatsApped an Everton friend of mine after the game on Saturday and just said to him, mate, and I was expecting a reply venting and saying, what a disgrace it had been. And the reply I got said, to be honest with you, it was almost funny. And I think the thing about being angry is it takes energy to be angry and you need stamina to stay angry for a long time. It's when that sort of, moves into resignation that you're in real trouble. And I wonder how long it'll be before Everton reach that point.
Matt, look, we've spoken about this before. I'd love you to bring us up to speed on, where the takeover situation looks like at Everton at this moment in time. It won't be MSP Capital Sports, it won't be 777 or the Freed King Group. Fascinatingly, a name that's popped up is John Textor, co-owner of Crystal Palace. How feasible is this takeover?
Oh, are you coming to me for good news? We only just met. What's going on? Don't do that. Don't do it in that order. That's not fair. You're making a mockery of what I do. Right. The takeover. Nothing's happening at the moment. All right. I could stop there. That is the reality. I did, I sensed that nothing was happening. I normally hear things, but I checked. I checked last night. I went round all the houses, all the people that have got an interest in this club. You heard anything? Nothing. All right. So nothing. I'll run through them if you like, without revealing sources. But nobody has made a serious or credible offer to the Freed King Group for the 200 million that they are owed, and as a condition of their loan, they would want repaying on a takeover, on a change of control. They've said that very clearly. Most big loans come with that string attached. No one's spoken to them. All right, so that's interesting, and that's also problem number one for John Textor or anyone else that wants to come along and buy Everton. Nothing has come new to the court, to the case that is going on in the States between 777/ACAP, who we've talked about in the past, this big insurance company that were basically bankrolling 777 for years and years and years, and now effectively own all of 777's assets, including a £200 million loan to Everton. Now, if someone's going to come along and buy Everton or do some kind of deal with that loan, which nearly every sane person would want to do, ACAP/777 have to bring it to the court because all their assets have been sort of temporarily frozen whilst they just sort out this dispute with this other company that they may or may not own 600 million to. That's ACAP, not Everton. Everton do own that much money, but not to different people. So nothing's happened there. Those are the two most significant things, really. They also run it by the club and Fahad Mashuri. Anything happened? So nothing has happened. What we've had, though, in the last couple of weeks is a sort of flurry of stories emanating from John Textor about his intentions for Everton. Now, let's be honest. Let's take him at his word as well. He desperately wants to buy an English football team and have control of English football team. He's assembled a multi-club group. He is a committed and sincere believer in the multi-club model. No doubt about that. I broke the story of him coming to buy Crystal Palace. I did a big interview with him at the time. I did another big interview with him last year. One of our colleagues, Matt Woosnam, our Crystal Palace beat reporter, has spoken to him at length. John Textor has never, ever changed or deviated from his belief in the multi-club model. He's also never changed or deviated from his belief in what he calls the purest form of democracy, shareholder democracy. He is a out-and-out capitalist. He strongly believes in American capitalism, and he thinks that floating companies on stock markets and giving people an opportunity to buy a chunk of them and having to report regularly, all that kind of transparency that comes along with being a listed company is a good thing. Here's the thing: a lot of people agree with it. Not making a big political statement there, but that a lot of people agree with that. Is it necessarily right for football? That's a different matter. It's quite interesting that North American sport doesn't let people do that with their teams. But anyway, we'll move on.
They do it elsewhere, right?
Yeah, they do it elsewhere. Well, he'd like to do it elsewhere. So anyway,
Yeah.
So we have Texter, who is sincere on multi-club, is sincere on wanting to float his multi-club group called Eagle Football, of which is comprised control of Botafogo in Brazil, control of Lyon in France, control of Molenbeek in Belgium, a small Belgian team, and 45%, this tricky 45% stake he has accumulated in Crystal Palace, which is either this wonderful strategic opportunity to buy into the Premier League, the world's most successful league, in a really cool, vibrant part of London that has an amazing production pipeline of talent, has great plans on and off the pitch, or it's the most expensive season ticket in history because he has 45% of the club, but he has 25% of the votes. And he gets outvoted on every key issue time and time and time again. And he's stuck. So he wants to, he needs to sell, he needs to get out of Crystal Palace before he can do anything anywhere else in England. So that's a massive hurdle. Now, the other thing is, fine, you'd say, okay, we'll just sell it. Presumably someone will buy his stake in Crystal Palace, and someone will, but not at a premium.
What's it worth, Matt? What's that? What is that stake in Palace worth?
Well, it's worth what people are willing to pay for it, Phil, which we can say about anything. And at the moment, and he's been trying to sell it via people like me with interviews when it was subtle, and then less subtle, i.e. hiring a big bank to put a great big sign out there and send brochures and what have you. He's been trying to sell it for over a year. And at the moment, the only real offers he's had have been from the other shareholders, who are the most logical people to buy it, at basically what he paid for it. But he can't accept that because he is massively over leveraged on what he spent on Lyon and what he spent on Botafogo. And he has this dream of floating the lot on the New York Stock Exchange. He's borrowed lots of money to accrue these assets. He can't really take he can't really take his money back. He needs to sell at premiums. Now, Lyon, I would argue, has gone down in value. He's already been flogging off assets there. Women's team, well, half the women's team, the indoor arena, their North American women's soccer team. They had a franchise over there. The value of all French teams has dropped because of their terrible TV deal. So he's got a bit of a Lyon problem. He's borrowed a lot of money there. He needs to sort of pay that back at some point. The solution to all of his answers, to all of his problems, is float. But to float, he needs a sexy Premier League team to sort of sit at the apex of his multi-club model. He hasn't got it at Palace because his partners at Palace aren't really interested in multi-club. So he's found himself very frustrated there. He's only really got people saying, we'll give you about 100 million for your 45%. He wants about 200 million, 250 million, because he thinks the whole thing is worth 500, 600 million. So you just take 45% of that. But like I said, he's not getting that. He's getting a discount because of that shareholder arrangement where he only gets 25% of the vote. Now he needs quite a big check. Now, if someone does come along and says, I will pay you, John, for your stake in Palace, he has a chance of doing this deal. He has a chance of buying Everton. But there are still then, we get back into our old conversations around the legal complexity of the Everton situation.
The two loans, Matt. I mean, this is the question I was going to come back to. You know,
well, hold on a minute. I haven't even finished. There's another loan. There's another loan. There's another loan.
Are those not insurmountable? For a buyer.
Well, then we get to the situation of how much is Everton worth. So let's just say he can get through the Palace situation. Someone pays him enough. He believes, and he said this on the record, again, John Textor does say things on the record, if I can get out of Palace, I think I can borrow money to buy Everton, to take control of Everton, and then make my group whole and complete. I've got this operation in Brazil. It's going pretty well. Botafogo are top of the table. Lyon are not. They nearly went down last year, but they finished the season very well. he's got some situations. He's got some problems in Lyon. The fans can't stand him, and it's all a bit problematic. But results could turn around there, like they did at the end of last season. Molenbeek is they went down last season, but they're small. They're almost inconsequential. He hasn't really made Molenbeek. He took them up. He took them down. They're neither here nor there. If he can get control of Everton, historic club, massive fan base, brand new stadium, place in the Premier League, there is something there. That is, if we're looking at multi-club groups out there, quite a cool one. Now, whether you think the whole thing can work or not, I don't know. It is pretty much an unproven thesis at the moment. But he'd at least be able to say, I'm doing it. I have started to move players around. Player trading has started. I'm in all the right places. Do you like my thesis? Yes or no? He would have something he could take to market, and he thinks he can borrow on the new stadium. He thinks he can leverage up at Everton. But we've talked about this before. This is pretty much the same idea that the Freaking Group had. This is pretty much the same idea that 777 had. Everyone has the same idea at Everton. Fan base, history, new stadium, place in the Premier League. Well, we've spent 15 minutes talking about the place in the Premier League. That's not guaranteed. We've done umpteen podcasts on the stadium. Could be good. We shall see. Very good if it's in the Premier League. Not so good if it's in the Championship. And Phil, we then get to Everton, heavily loss-making. They've lost 450 odd million, whatever it is, over the last few years. Those losses haven't got better, but they got worse from 22 to 23. I've mentioned the two big loans. There's another one to Rights Media Funding. They're more patient, they're more long-term lenders, but that's another 200 million there. So that's 600 million to three people, three different groups in secured loans. There's 450 million to Mashiri as well, but that's gone. Forget that. 600 million of debt at Everton. Before you get into, I need to spend some money on the team. I need to finish the stadium, which admittedly hasn't got much more to be spent on it. So I think I've spoken for long enough. I think you get the idea. Everton are a long way from being bought. Could John Textor do it? Yes. He has less than zero. He has a chance. I think it's a small chance because he's got his own issues to deal with. And then before he even gets into the Everton issues. But that's where we are.
Yeah. Paddy, I'm just listening to all of this, and I know we've talked about where Everton are at this moment in time. There's a part of me as a football fan wondering if perhaps, what happened to Aston Villa is probably a really good idea, maybe go down and then come back up once you've got your house in order. But I don't know if Everton can afford to go down into the Championship with such heavy loans and debt already accrued. Is Premiership survival just the most imperative thing for Everton right now?
Yeah, I think so. If we go back now, this is 3 years of successive relegation battles. And certainly the first one in 22-23, that would have been cataclysmic, I think, for the football club. Purely because even if you look at all the checks and balances you have in place, post-relegation, things like mandatory wage reductions and release clauses, all that kind of stuff. There was scant evidence of any of that, really. The club always argued that there was some sort of mechanism in place for some of the players, but certainly not for the vast majority of the squad. So I think if they'd gone down then, that would have been nightmare scenario. Slowly but surely, they've started to bring those things into place. And a lot more of the squad now have that kind of thing in their deals. But you still have a situation where you're funding a new stadium, where you're in debt, heavily in debt to 2, 3, sometimes 4 even different lenders. And that would be problematic in its own right. So yes, Everton have to stay in the Premier League by hook or by crook. And we've been saying that now for three seasons. We're probably into our 4th season of saying that. It is about survival until the new stadium. And the new stadium gives them a chance of something akin to rebirth. Or that, in theory, that's how it should go.
I was laughing to myself listening to that answer from Matt about Textor, and it was great, and there was so much detail in there which painted the picture perfectly. But I did think to myself, if you played that back to the uninitiated and said, does this sound like the saviour of your football club? I think the answer would probably be no, or not convinced. And there were aspects of what Matt was saying there which made me wonder whether this is more about Textor than it is about Everton, to be perfectly honest. But then again, and I keep saying this, I suppose it does just reflect where Everton are. You know, they're not. They are a Premier League club, and that makes them, I guess, attractive at the core. But they're not the most attractive Premier League club, and there are far better assets that you could pick up in the division. They're problematic in a lot of ways. There are a huge number of issues to sort out, and I think even if Textor was to buy the club tomorrow, just on the basis of what Matt has said there, I would be sceptical, and I am probably the world's most cynical bloke, but I would be sceptical about whether he could sort them out. You know, it sounds like a mess beyond belief. And I think the first protocol, as Paddy says, is not to get relegated. But this can't go on forever. You either sort this out at a much higher level, or it will get you eventually.
Yeah, Phil, you're absolutely right. And this is not just opinion, right? Let's just think about what's happened. They've been, as Paddy said some time ago, for sale for 2 years. Friedkins were not the first. 777 were not the first. MSP. I could go on. I've even forgotten some of them. If we go back 18 months ago. Brzezinski. There's more, right? A lot of people have looked. Competent people have tried to sell Everton. Deloitte have worked on it. I could list the law firms that have worked on it.
Yeah.
Lots of consultants and brokers have helped. And enough people have seen the brochure, right? Everybody knows what Everton have been and could be again. Everybody knows. But I'm afraid they've also, as they've got closer and gone, oh, dearie me, I didn't know about that. Oh, how much is that going to cost? So the full picture is what it is. Your point about John Textor is, I think, absolutely on point. This is very much about John Textor and his Eagle Football Group, which I do want to stress this. He sincerely believes in the multi-club model. He has delivered on a lot of what he said he'd do. And the things he hasn't delivered on are because he was a bit optimistic, perhaps a little bit naive, some might say. You know, he has tried. It is, he could argue, and I think it's fair to say, beginning to work in Brazil. They nearly won it last year. You know, is it working financially yet? No, but it was always going to be a bit of a long-term job there. Brazilian football has been a bit of a Wild West for a while. Give him a chance. Leon has been difficult, been very difficult, frankly. All his fault? No. I don't want to spend too much talking about the Leon situation, but it's a fascinating story of a reluctant sell. Well, the guy basically changed his mind about selling, and you know, the French league having its own problems that aren't Textor's fault, but maybe he should have known before he spent that much money on them. And the Belgian situation is, as I said, it's a smaller club. He went into a sort of an unpopular situation, and he's not made it any better. Has he made it any worse? I don't know. So that's and then the Palace situation again, which you could argue is a sort of failing of due diligence. He thought he'd get control of Palace eventually. He got that wrong. And I think he also, because he has this sort of optimistic, very kind of American sort of view of things, this sort of can-do attitude, I think he thought he might be able to persuade Steve Parish of the merits of the multi-club model. And he's failed. Steve Parish thinks about Palace morning, noon and night. He doesn't think about the multi-club model. Now, if you're an Evertonian listening to all this thinking, he's better than Farhad Mashuri, yeah, maybe he is. But he's not the answer. He can't be the answer to all your problems, because his is a sort of unproven experiment in many ways. And he's running pretty hot. You know, Eagle football is stretched. But this is where Everton are. It is a forced sale. It's a distressed asset. Amazing copper bottom blue chip buyers have had a look and they've said no.
Paddy, I'm trying to put myself in the seat of an Everton fan right now after listening to all of this, and I'm trying to find some positives. And actually, I'm thinking last season was interesting because without the point deduction, life could have been a much easier for Everton in the Premier League last season. Anything to look ahead to that we can cling on to this season and think, do you know what? Let's not lose hope just yet.
Yeah, so I think the new stadium, as we've touched on, that's a key strand here in the future of the club. That gives them a chance if they can get through intact. This time next year they will be there. So there is a huge opportunity there. And I still think that's the one thing in that hypothetical brochure that Matt's talking about there, that to prospective buyers, that's the one thing that has got them through to this stage, even in the eyes of investors. You have the core of a side that kept them up last season, despite 2 separate points deductions, still more or less intact. Jordan Pickford, James Tarkowski, Jarrod Branthwaite, Idrissa Gueye. That to me still doesn't look like a relegation spine. When you add in Dominic Calvert-Lewin, Iliman and Dye, that looks solid enough to get through, unless something unexpected happens. You have a manager that in those hugely challenging circumstances got them through last season. Player identification is good on the whole, if they can find a way of financing it. And off the top of my head, in the last 2 to 3 years, they've been in for and narrowly missed out on Mohamed Kudus, Morgan Gibbs-White, Brennan Johnson. This summer, Yankuba Minter was going to come until Dominic Calvert-Lewin rejected a move to Newcastle. There are some positive signs here. And I think when it comes down to the real clutch moments, when the fans are needed, and when there needs to be this kind of collective spirit, Everton as a club does seem to come together, does seem to almost thrive in the face of adversity, for want of a better phrase. There's a galvanising effect. Everton were at the strongest last season when Sean Dyche started talking about us against the world. Whenever there's a perceived sense of injustice, Goodison kind of burns with this passion. And it's very hard for the opposition to overcome at times, even when they're not playing well, Everton. So there is stuff to be positive about. There are still huge hurdles to come as well and to overcome. But yeah, hopefully that gives a few positives at least for Everton fans.
I'm just going to jump in there because I have been so gloomy, and I've made myself slightly. I've depressed myself.
Likewise, yeah.
He's now looking back at his life and thinking, you know what? I'm a nicer guy than this.
No, I am. And it's sunny outside, and I feel bad. So I'm going to just pick up on Paddy's point.
Yeah.
Right. Bramley Moore is really what's kept Everton afloat, in a weird sort of way. Yes, it's been incredibly expensive, and it's got them into all kinds of problems with the Premier League, as we know. But if you look at what's for sale, what's out there, and I think this kind of, Phill was sort of hinting at this, that they're not the only club you can buy, right? That scarcity value is so important, right, in any kind of auction type situation. But you could buy Wolves right now. You could buy Brentford right now. Brentford, I would argue, much better run. They've built a stadium. They're in London. But they're small, right? It's a small ground. I remember I've seen my team play them. I still find it quite hard to get my head around Brentford being this sort of Premier League side. But anyway, they are. But you can buy them if you want to. But you can buy chunks of West Ham. You can buy a stake in Palace, as we've discussed. You can buy a stake in Spurs, right? There's lots out there. There's lots of choice. But Everton are moving into a brand new, what looks like an iconic stadium, with their history, with their fan base, and with this long, amazing story about being a Premier League club, founding member of the English Football League, blah, 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 blah. They've got that story. If they can retain their status, that is quite a compelling pitch to make. None of those other clubs have just spent, well, all right, sorry, Spurs have. But anyway, forget Spurs for a bit. Very expensive. But most of those other clubs have not just built beautiful new stadiums for 750, 800 million, whatever it's going to cost at the end. That makes them attractive enough, even with all the doom and gloom I've said. But they have, of course, got to retain Premier League status.
That's the one. Right, let's end it there, gents. Matt, thanks for your time. Paddy, I know you've got to head off. Thank you for your time. And also, Phill, as always, appreciate you, man. Well, over the weekend, we heard the heartbreaking news that Sol Bamba sadly passed away at the age of just 39 years old. Sol was a friend of the podcast and kindly contributed to our coverage of both AFCON and the 2022 World Cup. Phill, I read the piece you wrote about him, really touching. You know, what are your thoughts on what's gone down? Because I personally, I'm deeply saddened by this.
Oh, me too. The best barometer of Sol's reputation, I think, has been social media over the past 2 or 3 days. He was a really good defender, accomplished centre back, played for Ivory Coast, played in the Premier League with Cardiff City. But everybody who has been writing about him on X and Instagram and other sites has been talking about his personality. You know, he had a huge heart and so much spirit, and also the most infectious smile you'd find anywhere in the game. I got to know him when he was a player at Leeds, but I got to know him better after he left, and then better again after he retired. And one of the things I loved about him was his accent, because this is a guy who'd grown up in Paris, African descent. He'd played in Turkey, played in Italy, but owing to the fact he'd been at Dunfermline and Hibernian up in Scotland, he had a little bit of my Edinburgh lilt, which I always found incredibly funny. I mean, the thing I think about more than anything else is his family. He leaves behind children and his wife Chloe, and never easy ever. But I think particularly tough when you're talking about somebody who was only 39. One of the last times I spoke to him, he was telling me that he was in the process of clearing his diary to qualify for his UEFA Pro license, and was dead set on getting that done. And I think, you know, I'm just left with the feeling that he had so much more to give and so much more to do, and I'll miss him greatly.
Yeah, same. I'm just glad he got to taste his coaching capabilities in Turkey as well. Such a top man, and we worked with him on AFCON and just lit up the room. So yeah, thoughts to his family at this moment. Thanks so much for your time, Phill, man. Really well put there. And also thank you guys for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.
If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.